His Excellency Alvaro Enrique Sanchez Cordero, Ambassador of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela to the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, Dr. Michael Pavinsky, IR faculty, convener and co-chair of this evening's proceedings, Ms. Angie Ramnarine, co-founder of the La Romaine Migrant Support, co-chair of this evening's event, and presenter. Ms. Alana Wheeler, our distinguished moderator of this exercise. Esteemed panelists, Ms. Gina Mirage, Legal Associate, United Nations High Commissioner on Human Rights, Mr. Jonathan Bagan, Chairman, Caribbean Committee Against Sex Crimes, Ms. Fayola Cooper, Attorney at Law and Director, Wells and Cooper Management Consultancy Limited, Mr. Christian Williams, Director, Quantum Foundation, colleagues and members of the St. Augustine campus community, students, other distinguished ladies and gentlemen, including members of the media, good evening. It is an honor and a privilege to bring you greetings and welcome remarks from the Institute of International Relations at this very important discussion forum. The ebb and flow of Trinidad and Tobago's migratory legal system, impact and challenges on Venezuelan migrants. In keeping with the mandate of the IAR, we host various kinds of events intended to promote discussion and exchange of ideas on a range of issues of relevance to the international relations of the Caribbean and regional development. The diversity of issues on which we engage highlights, among many things, the multidisciplinary nature of the IAR's work and its ability to bridge the gap between theory, policy, and practice. Importantly, these exercises promote its public presence, generate knowledge, and advance the policy relevance of our work. These initiatives are sometimes held collaboratively with both individuals and organizations. For the latter, they include research and policy bodies, national and regional governmental and non-governmental organizations, including civil society bodies. On this occasion, we are honored to collaborate with the community-based civil society group, the La Romaine Migrant Support Group, in keeping with this broad vision. I want to take some time to highlight the very important role which NGOs and other civil society organizations play in the development process. Among many other things, civil society organizations fill in gaps and complement the work of government on important issue areas, particularly in fragile circumstances. They are important sources of information to the state and to the citizenry. They monitor and help hold the governments and other actors accountable. They engage in advocacy and deliver services, especially to the vulnerable, exploited, and disadvantaged. We are pleased, therefore, to work with such organizations and provide the support for critical discussions to take place for informing policy direction and positive change. We are hoping this will not simply be another discussion, but that the key points and recommendations can be taken forward and the necessary follow-ups can occur for their adoption and implementation. The Institute of International Relations therefore extends many thanks to the La Romaine Migrant Support Group for the opportunity to collaborate on this seminar. Additionally, deepest gratitude to the chair and panelists who represent various segments of civil society for giving of your time, sharing your insights and perspectives. Together, these diverse views promise to bring increased empathy, clarity, and direction to a complex and sensitive issue. Our deepest appreciation to you, Ambassador Cordero, for your presence and participation. We are honored to have you here today. This shows the seriousness of this matter on the discussion. Last but by no means least, I wish to extend heartiest congratulations to Dr. Michael Pavinsky for organizing this webinar with the support of Tanisha Charles and other members of the Secretariat. Excellent program and panel you have brought together here today. Thank you to all others who have assisted in making this event a reality. Having said this, I wish all of you a very productive and enjoyable discussion. Thank you very much for your attention and for your presence.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much, Dr. Montoot, for that really clarifying to us the role of civil society organizations in building our country. His Excellency, good afternoon and welcome to you all. It is my joy and pleasure to invite His Excellency, Mr. Alvaro Sanchez Cordero, to provide us with some remarks. And before he does, I would just like to read a little background on His Excellency. He is the Ambassador of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela to the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. He has previously held important responsibilities in Barbados, the Netherlands, Russia, and the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Ambassador Sanchez Cordero has a degree in history from the Inter-American University of Puerto Rico. He is married to Miss Monica Ray, and they have a lovely daughter, Helena Sanchez Ray. It is my pleasure and my deepest honor to introduce you to this forum. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Alana. I would also like to take this opportunity to convey my gratitude to Dr. Anita Montoot, the director of the Institute of International Relations at U.W.I, and Ms. Gitanjali Ram Narayan, co-founder of La Romaine Migrant Support, for their kind invitation to join you today and deliver some remarks. I find this forum very, very opportune in order to analyze and portray in true light the situation of the Venezuelan migrant population here in Trinidad and Tobago. I would also like to refer this perhaps more generally. And I would begin by stating that, of course, not only Trinidad and Tobago, but many other countries have seen an increase in the number of Venezuelan migrants, something that is quite unusual, considering that not long ago, it was the other way around. Venezuela was a recipient country of migrants from many countries from around the world. So a few things turn around in the past 20, 25 years, and I will just try to offer some context in these few minutes that I have, so for the benefit of the discussion and for the knowledge and information of all the participants. Yes, we cannot take the migration or migrant situation of Venezuelans out of context, especially out of political context. Venezuela, as many of you will know, has been subjected to a protracted, continuous attack and destabilization process by the United States government that has seen many phases in this past 20, 25 years. It began, I would say, in a not very frontal way at the beginning, but nonetheless, we witnessed and suffer a lot from an attempted coup d'etat in 2002, to the stoppage of our oil industry in 2002, 2003, street sabotage financed by the United States in 2004, and the years went on. And it was only in the past 10 years that the view of the United States in order to topple the Venezuelan government and to bring regime change brought them to change the strategy, not only on Venezuela, but also in many other countries in the world. This is clearly stated. There are many publications, but I will just refer to two of them. The Art of Sanctions by U.S. Presidential Advisor Richard Nephew, and Treasury's War by Juan Zárate, who is the chief architect of modern financial warfare, among others, as I said, who have clearly and plainly stated that the way, the fourth generation warfare, as they call it, a hybrid warfare, in order to continue with the imperial premises of the United States, is to just concentrate on sabotaging the economy of countries that they consider their enemies. Now, they have done this in Venezuela, not successfully because the Venezuelan government remains in place, but it certainly has brought a lot of negative effects in our economy, and most importantly, in the well-being of our population. Just to summarize, and this is just a brief summary because it's very extensive what the United States mainly has been doing against Venezuela for the past close to 10 years. 7 billion US dollars have been frozen in international banks, along with 5 billion US dollars that the IMF has withheld from Venezuela from the special drawing rights, money that we and all the countries received after the pandemic, and nonetheless for us it was denied. In addition to 2 billion US dollars worth of gold that still the Bank of England has held against Venezuela and does not refuses to return to us. This is one aspect. In addition to that, we have international assets. Mainly, the main one is Citgo Corporation in the United States, which is a refinery company worth 18 billion US dollars, and they were completely taken over by the United States and granted to an individual who proclaimed himself to be president of Venezuela. Something as ludicrous and as fantasy as you can think, that's what happened. And perhaps the most important or the main attack from the United States against Venezuela has been the attacks against our oil industry, being oil our main foreign revenue earner. 95% of our revenues come from oil. Now it's a bit less because obviously we have expanded and diversified our economy. But the attack on our oil industry was really, really hard. 87% of our oil production collapsed. And this basically translated into 214 billion US dollars in losses from the oil industry in Venezuela. Just to have an idea, 214 billion US dollars, with that amount of money, Venezuela could have imported food and medicines for the entire Venezuelan population for more than 50 years, for more than half a century, with that amount that they practically denied from us through these forms of attack. And finally, in terms of these forms of attacks, financial, monetary, and economic against Venezuela, is the attack against our currency that was manipulated by these web pages in Miami, in the United States, manipulating the exchange rate, therefore creating a huge hyperinflation that obviously had a major impact, and again, in the life and livelihoods of our population. Just to quote two qualified, well, actually three, two of them in one and then the next one, qualified individuals in this matter. American economists Mark Weisbrot and Jeffrey Sachs, many of you will know who Jeffrey Sachs is, of course, from the Center for the Center for Economic and Policy Research, the CEPR. They delivered a report where they estimated that approximately 40,000 Venezuelan people died in Venezuela as a consequence of these so-called sanctions. That's another topic. They're not really sanctions. The only entity, according to international law, allowed to sanction any country is the Security Council of the United Nations Organization. No single country, for example, in this case, the United States, can actually sanction Venezuela or any other country for that matter. So we try not to call it sanctions, but the coercive unilateral measures. But in any case, in 2021, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights, Dr. Alina Duhan, she visited Venezuela and issued a report where she explained that sanctions have had, and I quote, a devastating effect on the entire population, especially those living in poverty, women, children, the elderly, people with disabilities or with life-threatening or chronic diseases, and the indigenous population. No straight-out society has been untouched, end of quote. This is again from the specialists from the United Nations in terms of the impact of the so-called sanctions against the enjoyment of human rights of people. Now, this is not just me saying this or the Venezuelan government saying this. I am going to briefly quote what US officials have said about what their intentions are. And let me begin with William Brownfield, who is a former US ambassador to Venezuela. He said the following, and I quote, if we are going to sanction PDVSA, PDVSA is the Venezuelan oil company, if we are going to sanction PDVSA, the entire people, the common people will be impacted. Consequently, the people will suffer so much from the lack of food, scarcity, medicine, public health, that at this moment, perhaps the best resolution will be to accelerate the collapse, even if this produces a period of suffering of months or perhaps years, end of quote. In addition to that, Admiral Kurt Titt, former commander of the U.S. Southern Command, in his paper, planned to overthrow the Venezuelan dictatorship, masterstroke, from the 23rd of February, 2018, said the following, and I quote, "Steps to speed up the definite overthrow of Chavismo, encourage popular dissatisfaction by creating a scarcity and rise in price of foodstuffs, medicine, and other essential goods, intensifying the undercapitalization of the country, the leaking out of foreign currency, and the deterioration of its monetary base, bringing about the application of new inflationary measures." This is said by another U.S. government officials. In the book that I mentioned earlier, The Art of Sanctions by Richard Nephew, there is one part in the book that says, the author says, and I quote, "The purpose of sanctioning, the purpose of sanctioning is to generate pain," end of quote. And just so we won't forget what the real reason for doing all this, let me just quote former American President Donald Trump, who a few months ago, only in June, said the following, and I quote, "When I left, Venezuela was ready to collapse. We would have taken it over. We would have gotten all that oil." That was in a speech in North Carolina on the 10th of June, 2023. So clearly, there was and there has been a clear intention by the United States government to create pain, to create suffering in the population. So the people will erupt, will rise, will provoke the coup d'etat, etc. As I said, that hasn't materialized. Certainly what has happened is that the economic consequences have been clear. And one of the consequences, of course, has been the phenomenon of migration. Many Venezuelans have had to leave mainly because of this situation. Allow me just to read this and just to keep this in mind, perhaps for the remaining of the forum. And it is the definition of what a refugee is. And this is according to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the UNHCR. A refugee is, and I quote, "someone who has been forced to flee his or her country because of persecution, war, or violence. A refugee has a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. Most likely, they cannot return home or are afraid to do so. War and ethnic, tribal, and religious violence are leading causes of refugee fleeing their countries." Obviously, in Venezuela, none of these. The government doesn't have any kind of policy, particularly against any particular group of people, persecuting them for political opinions, for race, for ideology, for none of the like. As I briefly explained, the reasons are very clear. These economic reasons that have been actually manipulated from abroad in order to destabilize and create havoc in Venezuela. In closing, I would like to just mention to you that very recently, only a few weeks ago, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro called and asked the United Nations organizations for assistance in organizing an international conference on migration patterns from a comprehensive and humane perspective. The idea, in addition to that, let me just mention this, there is a whole Venezuelan government program to bring Venezuelans in need back home. It's called the Plan Vuelta a la Patria, a plan returning to our homeland. More than 300,000 Venezuelans have been brought by the government from countries where they feel exploited, where they do feel exploited, persecuted, and abused and discriminated against and so on. They come back home thanks to this program. But equally, the Venezuelan government, President Nicolas Maduro, is trying to organize this forum in order to bring international participants and discuss ways and possibilities to address the rights that migrants have all over the world. This is quite telling, because sometimes we tend to forget that migration is a human characteristic of human beings since we are on the face of Earth, whereas the concept of nation states is only 200-300 years old. But migration is something that has been occurring by nature, by human beings. So therefore, through this conference, what the Venezuelan government would like to do is to address migrants' rights to citizenship, identification, right to work, right to social security, and to respect and dignity, and to avoid or to stop stigmatizing and discriminating and criminalizing migrants, not only Venezuelans in particular countries, but migrants all over the world. Just to finish, I will leave you with a quote by Dr. Alfred de Zayas. Dr. Alfred de Zayas is a UN independent expert on the promotion of a democratic and equitable international order. And I quote, "Venezuelan migration out of Venezuela is the consequence of the asphyxiating sanctions, which have directly led to unemployment and hunger. US sanctions are crimes against humanity, according to Article 7 of the Rome Statute." End of quote. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and have a productive discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, Your Excellency, for such a riveting remarks to this discussion. We are so looking forward to the comments from each of our panelists. So in the interest of time, as we see time is going very quickly, it is again my honor to introduce another great speaker and one who has been working very diligently with the Venezuelan community in our country. Her name is Miss Gitanjali Ramnarayan, better known as Angie. And Angie is a past secondary school teacher. She taught Spanish and French, English, and sociology in high school. And she founded a group called the Venezuelan Migrant. Let me get the correct name. It's called LARMS, L-A-R-M-S, but it's the Venezuelan Migrant Group. And Angie has been around for many, many years in the private sector and in other areas. And she started this group in March of 2019 to assist and to support the Venezuelan migrants who are in Trinidad and Tobago. So Angie, I hand over to you.
Dr. Anita Montoot, Interim Director of the Institute of International Relations of the University of the West Indies. Dr. Michael Pawinski, MSc Coordinator at the Institute of International Relations, and really the driver of this webinar. I thank you and your faculty for seeing it appropriate to host a webinar, which is of such critical importance in our contemporary Trinidad society. The ebb and flow of Trinidad and Tobago's migratory legal system, impact and challenges on Venezuelan migrants. It is indeed a topic requiring much candid discussion, and Venezuelan Migrant Support is indeed proud to be able to co-host a webinar of this nature, giving an issue of this magnitude a place of priority in our national discussions. Your Excellency, Senor Alvaro Enrique Sanchez Cordero, Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, deepest appreciation for gracing us with your presence as you participate in this event. And I must thank you for allowing us to look at things through your lenses. And that's what this webinar is about, to look at the phenomenon of migration through different lenses. To my fellow panelists, what an honor to be able to share space with you, as you are so much part of the legal landscape as it relates to migrants, refugees, asylum seekers. The Institute of International Relations certainly did not demonstrate any academic inertia, and it is certainly well placed to inform policy decisions through academic research and discussions, such as the one we are about to have this evening. So without further ado, we engage this august panel in meaningful discussion.
Thank you very much, Angie. And so now we are going to get into the panel presentations. Just a reminder for those who are viewing on YouTube that you can place your questions on the YouTube channel, and we'll discuss the questions at the ending of the panelists. So this afternoon we have 5 panelists who will be presenting different views. They're all lawyers, I understand. And our first presenter is going to be Ms. Gina Maharaj. We have all of their bios in the document that would have been shared with the persons who were registered. In the interest of time, we won't be able to read all the bios. So I would like to introduce you to Ms. Gina Maharaj, who is the legal associate of the UNHCR, and she will be sharing on the legal framework and international protection surrounding asylum seekers and refugees. Ms. Maharaj, it's all yours.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the introduction. A welcome to everyone who's attending today, and good afternoon to all. So I will be sharing a very short presentation. So just give me one moment to share it. Can I get a thumbs up to just confirm that everyone can see the presentation?
The screen is clear, we are seeing it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Okay, so again, my name is Gina Maharaj and I'm the legal associate. I work with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. For short, we are called the UN Refugee Agency, and we have an office in Trinidad and Tobago amongst many other countries across the globe. And my task today is to give an overview of the legal framework and the international protection surrounding asylum seekers and refugees. So just some general information about our office. The UN Refugee Agency is an international organization. We are part of the wider UN system of many agencies that I'm sure everyone would be aware of. We are a specialized unit that has a mandate to support with asylum seekers, refugees, and other persons in need of international protection. In Trinidad and Tobago, more particularly, we support asylum seekers and refugees. We are a humanitarian organization. We are non-political, and our core mandate is really to support with persons in need of international protection, persons in need of humanitarian assistance, and we are also here to support countries across the globe and in Trinidad and Tobago, states and governments in their response to persons with humanitarian needs who would have entered their various countries seeking asylum. So I would like to briefly start off with the definitions of asylum seekers, refugees, and distinguish them from migrants. So an asylum seeker, this is someone who have left their country of origin and is seeking protection from persecution in another country. So basically an asylum seeker is someone who they've crossed an international border because their country of origin or the country that they're habitually residing in, that state is no longer able to support with protection, safety, security. And because of that, they cross an international border into another country seeking protection from another state. So for example, let's just say I belong to a religious minority in one country, and for some reason, the members of my religious minority, we are being persecuted for our religious beliefs, and I'm not protected by my state. I can cross a border into another country and ask for safety, for protection from another state, and that country would give me asylum or the opportunity to apply for asylum. So many times we hear asylum seeker, refugee interchangeably, and they have a similar meaning, but they're also different. So different in the sense that it's an application process. So if I cross a border and I'm seeking asylum, I'm an asylum seeker, I apply for asylum. However, it doesn't mean that I should be granted the refugee status or that right to stay in another country, because I could, I may not meet the international or the domestic legal definition of who a refugee is, or there could be different issues with my claim, etc. So my case has to be assessed, my documents reviewed, interviews are conducted, and if the refugee status determination officer decide that I meet this definition of who a refugee is, my claim checks out, it's valid, I could be granted refugee status. So basically, a refugee is someone who has been determined to meet the refugee definition because the process is completed and a final decision is made. One important thing to note, however, is both asylum seekers and refugees, they cannot be returned to their country of origin as they could face a serious risk of harm. Even asylum seekers, even though their claims have not been fully decided, they still should be considered as people who may be refugees, and because of that, they should not be returned to their country of origin. Because of that, they may face grave violations of human rights. Okay? So an asylum seeker, they haven't been legally recognized as a refugee and they're waiting to receive a decision on their asylum claim. A refugee went through the process of asylum and has been determined to be a refugee. And yes, of course, some cases could be denied, and some persons, although they are applying for refugee status, they may be denied refugee status because they just didn't meet the definition of who a refugee is. So not every asylum seeker will ultimately be recognized as a refugee, but every refugee is initially an asylum seeker. Now, migrants, of course, these are persons staying outside their countries of origin. They are not asylum seekers or refugees. They don't have international protection needs. These would be, for example, our families and friends who have moved abroad for economic opportunities, for study, but they can return home and visit because they have no serious risk or violation of their human rights. Right. So I mentioned the word protection a few times. So just to give a brief description of what protection is, protection are programs and services offered that supports asylum seekers, refugees, people with international humanitarian needs to have better lives in the countries that they're in. This could be, for example, bridging gaps in language barriers, education to persons, work permits, etc. Anything that could mitigate their circumstances in the place that they're seeking asylum. So the right to seek asylum, where is this found? Well, it's found in a declaration that I think most of us may have heard of. It's called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it says that everyone has the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. So even us as Trinidadians, we have that right to seek asylum in another country. It is a universal human right. It is important to note, however, that there are certain exceptions, and lawyers would know this, that every rule has an exception. Persons who may be deemed a threat to national security may be denied asylum or refugee status. It is called an exclusionary clause. Okay. And this whole concept of refugee status, refugee determination, UNHCR, we gain our mandate from the 1951 Refugee Convention and its 1967 protocol. So Trinidad and Tobago acceded to the 1951 Refugee Convention in November 2000. The convention defines who a refugee is. It establishes the principle of non-refoulement, and it sets out the duties of refugees and the responsibilities of the state. So some of these rights of refugees would include non-discrimination, access to courts, work rights, education, freedom of movement, family reunification, the right to documentation, the right to access to territory, the right to apply for asylum, etc. So many rights that are intricate human rights that all people as human beings enjoy. I will touch on the principle of non-refoulement a little bit later on, but it basically means the principle of non-return. And under the 1951 convention, this is the very detailed definition of who a refugee is. So owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is outside the country of its nationality and is unable or owing to such fear is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country. So the 1951 convention defines who a refugee is, right? International law, international conventions, they provide minimum standards of which countries ought to abide by. But in many countries around the world where there's legislation for refugees, they may have different ways of interpreting international standards and applying who a refugee is. There's also regional bodies, of which I will give an example of a little later on, that sort of sometimes expands this definition of who a refugee is. So Trinidad and Tobago, so we did accede to the convention in November 2000, but Trinidad being a dualist state, we need local legislation to implement the provisions of this international treaty that we signed on to. However, at this time, there is no local legislation. But UNHCR is here to support the states in implementing a legislatory framework, a national framework in the future. Right. So some of these categories of who a refugee is, many may be obvious, but just to point out membership of a particular social group, because this might be one that may be less obvious to persons. These could be members of the LGBT community or survivors of gender-based violence. A new refugee definition is deemed declaratory, which basically means a person is a refugee as soon as he fulfills the criteria contained in the definition. This would necessarily occur prior to a formal determination of his or her refugee status. So what does this mean? It basically means that although there is a system or an application procedure to apply for refugee status, it doesn't mean that a person is not a refugee because they didn't submit a formal application. Right. So, for example, if I cross a border to apply for asylum or to seek refugee status, even though I have not made an application, it doesn't mean I'm not a refugee. I may still have very dire humanitarian needs. I may need protection from the country. So what it basically means is that persons, regardless of whether a formal application has been done or not, they should be treated as a refugee until that application procedure could be initiated, because at many times, especially where there are large numbers of persons crossing borders, it may not be possible for states to have an application process in a very quick manner that is needed for everyone to apply. So in that instance, they should be declared as a refugee until there is a process whereby they can formally apply and go through the whole procedure. So the principle of non-refoulement is found in the 1951 Convention, and it is the cornerstone principle of international refugee protection. It basically means that it basically states, that no contracting party state shall expel or return a refugee in any manner whatsoever to the frontiers or territories where his life or freedom would be threatened on account of his race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. So it is the principle of non-return, meaning that refugees, they should not be returned to their countries of origin because they can face grave violations of human rights. Their lives could be in danger, the lives of their family can be in danger. So that principle of non-refoulement or non-return must be protected. And some examples of non-return could be not rejecting someone at the border of an entry, not returning them from the territory if they've been there for a couple of years. And there's also the concept of indirect refoulement, where you can send someone to another country and there's the potential of that person to be returned from this third country to their country of origin. So in all those cases, some people, asylum seekers and refugees, should be protected from non-refoulement. Right. So although Trinidad and Tobago, there's no domestic legislation to protect refugees and asylum seekers, there are some national frameworks that we can look at in terms of looking for ways to protect them. And one is our constitution. So the constitution does not distinguish between a national and a non-national. So all those beautiful rights under the Constitution would apply to refugees, asylum seekers, and of course other non-nationals. And this would include the right to education, the right to access to courts, to an attorney, to an interpreter, etc. And then in 2019, the government implemented the Venezuelan framework, the Venezuelan registration process, by which nationals from Venezuela were given the right to work. And this was an approach in response to the numbers of Venezuelan nationals entering Trinidad and Tobago, and they were given that right to stay legally and to work legally in the country. And in 2014, the government did draft a refugee policy that also discussed some of the rights asylum seekers and refugees should be afforded, the right to non-detention, non-refoulement, education, etc. The refugee policy hasn't been implemented as yet, but it was a really good start towards having a refugee framework for the country. Okay. And finally, I am just concluding on a document called the 1984 Cartagena Declaration on Refugees. So I mentioned earlier that there may be other documents, legal frameworks around the world which might expand that 1951 definition of who a refugee is. One is the Cartagena Declaration, which is a non-binding instrument for the protection of refugees that was adopted by delegates from 10 Latin American countries. It allows for a broader category of persons in need of international protection to be considered as refugees. And it basically states that refugees should include persons who have fled their country because their life, safety, or freedom have been threatened by generalized violence, foreign aggression, internal conflicts, massive violation of human rights, or other circumstances which have seriously disturbed public order. So in conclusion, I also just want to mention that UNHCR's office in Trinidad and Tobago, we have asylum seekers and refugees from 43 different countries, not only Venezuelan nationals, but we have Cubans, persons from the African region, from Asia, all over the world. It's a very mixed diaspora applying for asylum in Trinidad and Tobago. And feel free to also look on our website if you would like any more information about the office here and the services that we provide. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Maraj. A lot of information packed into a short, tight 15 minutes. And you said 43 countries. We have migrants and refugee applications from 43 countries. That's quite a bit. And just to give you a heads up, we do have questions coming in for Ms. Maraj, and we also have a question coming in for His Excellency. So I hope that the ambassador is going to stay on with us for the discussion so that he can respond to any questions. All right, so moving on to the next panelist. And as I said, it's going to be quite a dynamic session. So we're going to reintroduce you again to Ms. Geetanjali Ramnarayan. You've already met her earlier on from her opening remarks. She's a co-founder of LARMS, that's the La Romaine Migrant Support Group. So Ms. Ramnarayan, just to remind the panelists that you have 10 to 15 minutes for the presentation. We have lots of time at the end for discussion and questions, Q&A. And for the participants, those of you on YouTube, we invite you to post your questions on the YouTube chat, and we will respond to those questions at the ending. So Ms. Ramnarayan, over to you.
Okay. I chose as my topic today legislative inertia, working on the ground with the Venezuelan innocents. I will explain why I chose that as we go along. The first thing I just want to touch on very briefly would be some of the push factors that caused so many migrants to make Trinidad and Tobago a port of call. So when our small island state of Trinidad and Tobago became the unwitting host to thousands of Venezuelans fleeing their economically and politically tumultuous homeland to seek a better life abroad, starting in about 2014, but really crescendoing about 2018, 2019, Our society from top down seemed to be caught unawares and unprepared for this deluge of migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. It was incredible that what was once the richest country in the Western Hemisphere and had been a host country to so many Trinidadians had become, that Venezuela had become a country of collapsed institutions. Years of American sanctions have taken a heavy toll on Venezuela, plunging it into a political, economic, and humanitarian crisis, pushing over 8 million people to migrate over the last decade, making it the second largest displacement worldwide, behind only Syria. Needless to say, hunger and poverty were rife. And given our geographical position, a mere 7 miles from our southernmost coast to Venezuela, it was only natural that those from the Delta Amacuro region, especially, would have found here their first port of call. Ladies and gentlemen, participants and attendees of this webinar, I present to you this evening completely from the perspective of a layperson, an ordinary citizen who has been doing what she thought was the morally and ethically correct thing to do, help incoming migrants and refugees in my own neighborhood. And the question became, how? All right? Figuring out that the only talent I possessed was some teaching skills. I thought maybe we can start with the children. And given my background in teaching, I thought that was the most obvious place to start. Because in trying to help adult migrants, I soon came to discover that they had children who were shut-ins. And while their parents searched for opportunities, sometimes futilely, I could see how unhealthy it was to have these children unsupervised for hours. It was not uncommon to see children as young as 6 or 7 being left with 2 and 4-year-old siblings to care for as their parents eked out a living on the outside. Surely, I thought, this could not be healthy or right. At the same time, the Catholic Church was openly and publicly saying, we have space in some of our primary schools and we are willing to educate migrant children. At a post-cabinet conference in June of 2019, a mere maybe 2 or 3 months after La Romaine Migrant Support, and I would say sort of pioneered this work on the ground. All right, our Prime Minister, Dr. Keith Rowley, is quoted as saying, and I quote, if the Catholic Church in its pastoral work gets involved with trying to educate the Venezuelan children who are not going to go to school, that is acceptable in Trinidad and Tobago. He added, if the school decides to take in certain people in their pastoral work, I don't know that the government can say to the Catholic schools, don't let so-and-so come through your gate, unquote. So I want to commend first the Catholic Church. It must be credited with making its stance on migrants and refugees public, even creating specific ministries to protect, promote, and integrate migrants and refugees. The AMMR, the Archdiocesan Ministry for Migrants and Refugees, the PMMR, the Parish Ministries for Migrants and Refugees, established in 2018, demonstrated the Catholic Church commitment to this displaced group. Let us not forget that historically, the Catholic Church has always been mindful of what it sees as its obligation, the call to help refugees, starting with its view that Jesus Christ himself was a refugee since a child, and he had to flee with his parents from his native land in order to escape persecution. And we do have historical examples during World War II. Pope Pius XII spoke out against the atrocities of the innocent and defenseless, including people of foreign race or descent, referring specifically to the Nazi policy of unjust oppression of the Jews. In every age, therefore, the church felt itself called to help refugees. And the present Pope Francis has put it, migrants and refugees do not represent a problem to be solved, but are brothers and sisters to be welcomed, respected, and loved. So it was only natural that the Catholic Church, as part of its credo, led the call for the humane treatment and protection of Venezuelan migrants and refugees. What was missing, however, was a clear statement from our state as to how it perceived the migrant situation and how it proposed to deal with the new demographic. In a 2-week period between May 31st, 2019 and June 14th of the same year, government decided to register Venezuelan nationals in Trinidad and Tobago, providing them with official permits to live and work here for a period of time, protected by many of the same laws that protect citizens and residents of Trinidad and Tobago. They were to have access to places of work and so on. And even in the healthcare system, while there was free healthcare for registered Venezuelans, it was only for emergency medical services. What, however, was not addressed was the issue of state-sanctioned schooling for migrant and refugee children. In an article on the Express of March 29th, 2023, Curtis Williams, managing editor of the Express, opined that after almost 4 years past the registration of Venezuelan nationals, that the government should have known that it had a moral responsibility to protect these children, and part of protecting them must mean allowing them to go to school. What we have now is a number of children who are being made into an underclass and who will have little choice of success, unquote. An announcement was made on July 14th, 2023 via the Honorable Dr. Amory Brown, Minister of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs, that refugees and migrant children would be included in the national school system at primary school level. The UN country team welcomed the decision, recognizing that, and I quote, access to education is fundamental to the lives of children, their families, and the futures of countries that host them. Children attending schools propel families forward and support integration and language acquisition, as well as provides a sense of normalcy and security. It gives an opportunity to think about the future and find pathways towards economic and social stability of the family. Yet to date, not one of our single refugee migrant children has found a place in any national primary school. The criteria was that 1, they had to be children of registered migrants. 2, they had to have some English language proficiency. 3, would have taken an assessment test administered by the university. And last but not least, get a student's permit from the Immigration Division. Perhaps it is this last criteria that is the stumbling block. So the few child-friendly spaces that exist, including Laramie Migrant Support, all right, struggle against all odds to provide some sort of literacy and numeracy skills to enable migrant and refugee children with or without government registration to become functional in the society they now inhabit. They are in dire need of suitably qualified personnel and funding to administer to the needs of displaced children. Policy in the absence of legislation. In an article produced in October of 2017, Rochelle Naked and Andrew Welsh, by both of them, aptly entitled Protection in the Absence of Legislation in Trinidad and Tobago, the authors succinctly noted that Trinidad and Tobago has a refugee policy, but no legislation, and that while we acceded to the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees and its 1967 protocol in November of 2000, to date, they have not been incorporated in domestic legislation. For people like myself working on the ground, it becomes a delicate balancing act, attempting to meet humanitarian needs while being cognizant of what can be realistically done given legal constraints. Let's take a look at education. In its policy statement, the Ministry of Education of Trinidad and Tobago says it is committed to, I quote, a seamless education system in which inclusive education is a major component. It shall provide support and services to all learners by taking appropriate steps to make education available, accessible, acceptable, and adaptable, unquote. And while public school places in Trinidad and Tobago are reserved primarily for Trinidad and Tobago citizens, the law provides for foreign nationals to access schooling through application for a student's permit. Student permits are by law only granted where a local student has been where no local student has been displaced and there's adequate accommodation for the foreign student at the school. To apply for a student's permit, a certificate of immigration status is required. The government has said that only the children with the MRF migrant registration framework cards can be eligible. But what about the huge numbers of displaced migrant children whose parents do not have this card? We simply cannot pretend they don't exist. And this is where CSOs and NGOs have to continue against many odds to make sure that the child's inalienable right to an education is supported. But let's talk about the realities on the ground. What happened after the announcement was made? A few students, children of registered migrants, took the assessment exam, and that was it. Parents were not apprised of the next steps. Were they told that students entering primary schools here must be vaccinated? And what types of vaccines are required? Which brings me a little to the issue of healthcare. I have gone to healthcare centers with migrant children who were told that they couldn't be vaccinated because they are foreigners. And yet other health centers in this same country gave the vaccination. It was not a problem. I have gone to hospitals where healthcare professionals are either afraid or divided on how they should treat with migrants. We at Laramie Migrant Support have had many times to solicit the services of private healthcare professionals at a cost. Incidentally, in the recent renewal process of government registration cards, certificates of character were given by some police stations and not others. So on the ground, there's an unevenness of treatment by certain institutions of society, which makes it all the more confusing for migrants themselves. Migrants live in an environment characterized by fear, ignorance, and instability. And because they don't perceive the law as protecting them, they often become victims to abuse and exploitation. Children and adults who are victims of gender-based violence, for example, are very reluctant to report to the police for fear of being deported. Working on the ground with migrant children means that their parents and or guardians live in an atmosphere of fear, uncertainty, and instability. They too are similarly affected. As stated in the National Child Policy of 2020 to 2030, the government's vision is that, and I quote, that all children are happy, healthy, and confident, and their rights are respected, protected, and promoted to facilitate their holistic development towards achieving their fullest potential as constructive members of society now and in the future. Interestingly, the government of Trinidad and Tobago ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child on December 5th of 1991, 2 years after it was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly on November 20th, 1989, but has not done the same for the 1951 Refugee Convention. At that time of ratifying this convention on the rights of the child, migrant and refugee children were not part of the demographic landscape, but now they are. I can only hope that all really means all. Meanwhile, it means that all immigrants are subject to the provisions of the Immigration Act. So Justice Frank Sipasa's ruling that refugees can be deported is correct in law, but it again pointed to the urgent need for a legislative response. The United Nations High Commission for Refugees said it welcomed the comments as it points a legislative way forward on the incorporation and integration of migrants into society and its workforce. Once there's legislative tardiness, that seems like inertia. We simply cannot move forward as a society. And it is left up to the CSOs and NGOs who share the vision of migrants' protection and the potential valuable contribution they can make to the whole society to fill these gaps. Thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you so much, Ms. Ramnarine. And really, I'm sorry, this light is, this is my reading lamp. Let me see if I can turn it down. And thank you for the work, the tremendous work that you have been doing in the community, particularly in the south of Trinidad. And also thank you to all the other NGOs and CSOs who have been doing tremendous work in supporting the migrants in our country. So I'll move on to the next speaker, the next panelist. We have 3 more panelists to go. And again, a reminder of a 15-minute maximum presentation. And a reminder to those viewing on YouTube to please post your questions on the YouTube channel and they will be sent to us. So our next speaker is Mr. Jonathan Bagan. He is the chairman of the Caribbean Committee Against Sex Crimes, and he is going to speak on the impact of refugee policy on human trafficking. Mr. Bagan, it's all yours.
Thank you, Alana. So just a quick dictionary definition of human trafficking. Keep in mind, this is not the legal definition. Human trafficking is the unlawful act of transporting or coercing people in order to benefit from their work or service, typically in the form of forced labor or sexual exploitation. So human trafficking law does not require a transit across a border, as in the case of some Venezuelan migrants. But in the context of today's discussion, it does cover that. So looking at Section 38 of the Trafficking in Persons Act, the Trafficking in Persons Act says that the minister may provide victims of trafficking and accompanying dependent children with appropriate permits or other required authorization to allow them to remain and work in Trinidad and Tobago for the duration, the important part, for the duration of criminal prosecution against traffickers. So the problem is this good law. The problem with the law is that the reality on the ground with the police service, the directors of public prosecutions, and the judiciary does not really give survivors of trafficking the best options. So a trafficking case can drag on for 10 years. We presently have a 0% conviction rate for human trafficking. Most of the cases have fallen apart. In many cases, charges are never laid. So some migrants cannot fully benefit from these protections under the law. Survivors of any serious crime, because as the Caribbean Committee Against Sex Crimes has been working since 2015, our initial focus was on rape, and well, we moved on to trafficking as we saw the need. Only in first world countries, only about 2% of all rapists actually spend time in prison. In Trinidad, we have a 2.6% conviction rate for rape, 2.6%, and a 0% conviction rate for human trafficking. So there are all these odds stacked up against the survivors, and in an ideal situation, a survivor of a serious crime ought to have a year or two of recovery, psychological counseling, recuperation before they even make the decision to prosecute. But the present legislation seems to tie the decision to prosecute with protection under the law. So I'm going to look at Dr. Jason Haynes's textbook, Caribbean Anti-Trafficking Law and Practice. Jason Haynes was actually in my class and Gina's class in Barbados in University of the West Indies, brilliant guy. So, quoting from the textbook, in short, therefore, given the procedural challenges highlighted above, it is unlikely that the vast majority of transnational trafficking victims, as in this case of Venezuelan migrants, will be considered as refugees for the purpose of the Refugee Convention, and would accordingly not benefit from protection against refoulement under the Convention. However, it is arguable that the non-refoulement obligation may in fact arise under other international instruments, such as Article 8.2 of the UN Trafficking Protocol, which Trinidad did sign, which requires that states pay due regard to the safety of trafficking victims whom they wish to repatriate, and the ICCPR. In general comment number 31, the Human Rights Committee expressed the view that although the ICCPR, that's another treaty in international law, does not explicitly impose a non-refoulement obligation, this obligation could be subsumed under Article 2 in circumstances where the person to be extradited, deported, or expelled has substantial grounds for believing there's a real risk of irreparable harm, such as torture or inhumane degradation, as prohibited by Article 7 of the ICCPR. To benefit from the consequence of protection, however, the victim will have to prove that he or she faces a real risk of serious harm upon removal, evidenced by a real risk of being re-trafficked, resulting from the instability or unwillingness of her or her state or of nationality to protect him or her. The fact of having been trafficked in the first place will, however, not be on its own sufficient to engage the non-refoulement obligation of the ICCPR. So, of course, this is Dr. Haynes's legal opinion, and I do not think that there's a brief aside on Trinidad is a dualist state. That means that generally for international law to apply to Trinidad, we have to incorporate it via legislation. In this recent case, LGBT case of Jason Jones against the Attorney General, the court looked at several international treaties and rulings of international courts in making is interpreting the Constitution. So there was a way for the judges to look at the international law, look at the ICCPR and the Refugee Convention to find a non-refoulement position in Trinidad's law, or at least, come to some conclusion in benefit of refugees, but they chose not to in this case. So, among other issues facing victims of trafficking, survivors of trafficking, would be that if they are returned to Venezuela, there are organized crime groups such as Tren de Aragua that allegedly Tren de Aragua now has 5,000 members in Venezuela and across the region. That they operate as one of the largest and most well-funded organized crime groups in the region. So a victim of trafficking, that is one of the many gangs there. So a victim of trafficking who was trafficked into Trinidad, if they are forced to return, could end up being re-victimized by the same gang that captured them and trafficked them here. So that is a very serious concern. So there is a need for legislative reform for the government of Trinidad and Tobago. Interestingly enough, we have this position in the UN General Assembly, and yet we are constantly in breach of international law. I think our government is too much big on pomp and ceremony and not big on actually getting results done. It's a very simple matter to look at the Belize policy on refugees, copy and paste half of it, which is what a lot of legislation is done. How a lot of legislation is done in Trinidad, and push it through Parliament, but there's no will to do it for reasons that I do not understand. I'm looking at the Trafficking in Persons Report 2023. This is the US government's Trafficking in Persons Report. Corruption and official complicity in trafficking crimes, including at senior levels, remain serious concerns. That is, the police service and different bodies of government seem to be involved in human trafficking in Trinidad. So this corruption inhibits law enforcement action. Victim identification, referral, and services remain weak and inconsistent, and interagency coordination was poor. Because the government of Trinidad and Tobago has devoted sufficient resources to a written plan that, if implemented, would constitute significant efforts to meet minimum standards of fighting trafficking, Trinidad and Tobago was granted a waiver as per the Trafficking Victims Protection Act from an otherwise downgraded tier 3. So Trinidad is basically at risk of being downgraded to the lowest possible tier of the trafficking in TIP report, trafficking in persons report. That may happen next year unless some sort of breakthrough happens. Keeping in mind we have a 0% conviction rate. We have some cases before the courts, but many have been dismissed on legal technicalities and fallen apart. So I would love to ideally bring jurisprudence on our trafficking, anti-trafficking law, but there is none to be had because of having no convictions. And There's not even a judgment that I can, where the DPP lost the case before the High Court right now, where I can cite, some sort of jurisprudence. Just closing off, Amnesty International in 2023 noted that Trinidad and Tobago deported 98 Venezuelan nationals. This Amnesty International released this report that said authorities must stop deporting refugees and asylum seekers. It says, in response to the deportation of 98 Venezuelan nationals by the authorities of Trinidad and Tobago over the weekend, Erica Rivera-Rosas, America's director at Amnesty International, said, the recent measures taken by the authorities of Trinidad and Tobago are extremely alarming. Human rights crisis and complex humanitarian emergency in Venezuela are of such magnitude that 25% of the nation's population has been forced to flee the country in the last few years, a figure that continues to rise. International law leaves no room for doubt. Refugees and asylum seekers throughout the world cannot be returned to places where their life and integrity could be at risk. No one can be subjected to mass expulsions. So, to summarize my presentation, in essence, the gaps in the refugee policy and legal framework in Trinidad and Tobago may help facilitate human trafficking and may provide gaps that human traffickers can exploit. And the practice of refoulement may be basically preventing survivors of human trafficking from recovering and testifying before the courts of Trinidad and Tobago. And there's need, it's very, very simple to draft legislation since there's so much precedent, push it through the parliament in 2 months, and it's a lack of political will on the government, and people of Trinidad and Tobago are suffering, and the Venezuelan migrants and refugees and asylum seekers are also suffering as a result of the inaction of this government. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. And thank you for staying within the time. Well, within the time, I should say. So we do have some more questions coming in. We are seeing some more questions for the ambassador, for the UNHCR, for Angie. Not seeing anything as yet for Jonathan. I'm sure those will come. I'd be interested, though, to know some of your statistics on the status of the court cases, the human trafficking court cases, where you indicated that the cases are falling apart. It would be interesting to see what those numbers look like, in terms of the numbers before the courts in comparison to what is actually cases that are being dismissed. Okay, so let's move on to another lawyer in our panel, and this is Ms. Fayola Cooper. She is an attorney at law and director of the Wells and Cooper Management Consultancy Limited. Ms. Cooper, are you ready? Yes, I'm seeing her on. Yes. She is going to talk about the movement of immigrant workers and its impact on Trinidad and Tobago economy. Very interesting topic. Ms. Cooper, it's all yours.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. I must say thankful for being selected to be on this panel this afternoon. Quite a lot of information, which I appreciate. I'm going to keep my contribution quite short. What I really want to discuss, based on the discussions already held this afternoon, I want us to take a look at the impact of the migrants on our economy in terms of the world of work. Points were made about the negative aspects, of course, that the Venezuelans and the migrants experience, but we also have to look at the other aspect as well. In terms of migrant workers, I think what they really want to know and what they really want to gain knowledge on is whether or not they are entitled to certain aspects in terms of as a worker. So for instance, in Trinidad and Tobago, when you work, your employer is expected to pay NIS contributions. Now, based on the National Insurance Act, it states that once a worker earns a minimum of $200 per week, that the employer ought to pay NIS contributions for the worker. The question is, how does that impact migrant workers? Because what we are seeing in our economy, at least or in Trinidad and Tobago, at the moment, we are seeing, of course, an influx, of course, due to the increase of migrants in our country. We are seeing Venezuelans, we are seeing other nationals as well being part of the main workforce. I would have done some research and I would have gone so far as contacting national insurance to find out whether or not migrant workers, whether or not employers are required to pay contribution on behalf of migrant workers. And I was informed that once the workers are earning a minimum of $200 per week, they are in fact entitled to make NIS claims, be it in the form of, let's say, sick leave, injury leave. Of course, there are some gray areas which, of course, would need some legislation drafted to make it clear. They did say as well that they intend to launch a campaign to make, to bring clarity to this as well. In addition to which, migrant workers are also able to go before the Ministry of Labor if there's any disputes between themselves and their employers. They are also open to seeking redress as well before the Minister of Labor. In fact, the Ministry of Labor has stated that they have received an influx of migrant workers actually coming to the Ministry of Labor seeking redress, and they are proceeding with their claims as well. So I just want us to note in terms of migrant workers being able to access certain avenues which regular Trinidadian citizens can access. In fact, they are also able to access that at this point. The Ministry of Labor does state that they know that not many migrant workers are also willing to come forward. This is due, of course, because of what would have been stated by one of the panelists, that they are, of course, some of them are experiencing, that aspect of fear of going forward and making an application. But in recent times, the Ministry of Labor has stated that they have been seeing an influx of migrant workers, including Venezuelans, approaching the Ministry of Labor to have redress in terms of being treated unfairly by their employers as well. In addition to which, I just want to note that these are forums that, of course, the legal framework is not fully developed in Trinidad and Tobago to facilitate migrants, but there are avenues that migrant workers can entertain and can pursue in order to have redress. So I don't want, we're going down a road where we're having a discussion, yes, about where we need to reform, things that are required in terms of improvement. Of course, there's need for improvement, but I just wanted to be noted as well that there are also forums for migrant workers to access. The ones who do have permits as well, the ones who don't have permits as well, they are entitled to actually pursue action if required. So, in terms of the impact of the migrant workers as well on our economy, of course, as a result of having migrant workers, we are seeing on the positive side and we're seeing on the negative side, we are seeing that a lot of generally Venezuelan migrants are being used. You see them in the stores, you see them in the car washes in terms of regulating salaries. Ministry of Labor has stated that they ought to be paid and should be paid in keeping with the Minimum Wages Act, and that they should not be paid less. So there is legislation in place, there is legislation that needs to be worked on, but we do have some framework in place that can assist the migrants and their ability to function I would not say on the same level as a Trinidadian national, but there's actually framework that can assist the migrants in functioning and their avenues. So in closing, if guidance is required on the options that are available to migrant workers, I can provide that guidance if required.
Okay, Ms. Cooper, have you ended? You're finished? Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Cooper. Ms. Cooper, your presentation has brought hope to many of us who, may have lost some hope in the system. Very valuable information. I think it's also very important that the migrants are aware of their rights. I know the Ministry of Labor has been doing a lot of work with respect to that, especially the labor inspectors. They have been doing a lot of outreach and sensitization and everything. So I do look forward to seeing some of your material probably translated into Spanish so that the Spanish-speaking community can benefit from that information. I myself was not aware of the NIS rights that they had, $200 a week. I mean, that would be most of them.
Yes.
Who would be entitled to that and their NIS claims, because some of them, they're getting pregnant and they're getting some injuries on the job and stuff. So that's very, very important. So I know Angie is taking notes, and Angie herself may be aware of some of this information, but I hope that you and Angie can connect and really ensure that that information gets to the migrants.
Yes.
So you're well within your time. Thank you, Ms. Cooper, for giving us those extra minutes to be able to do some more discussion. So we'll move on to the next panelist, and that is Mr. Kriston J. Williams. He is the director of Quantum Foundation. He's no stranger to the public, to the national community. And he will speak on the systemic failure and the impact of allegations of gross violation of human rights. So, Mr. Williams, again, we just have up to 15 minutes maximum for your contribution, and then we'll get into our discussions.
Hi, pleasant evening, everyone. All protocols observed. The ambassador, is very nice to have you here. Gina, everyone, just thanks. So let me start, seeing that time is limited. Okay, firstly, well, my presentation is based upon systematic failure and gross violations of human rights. So to understand where we are now, I think that it's important for us to go back in the past. And when we go back in the past, that will directly touch upon what the good ambassador said. Then we can discuss the present and discuss the future, what the future holds for us. So for the purposes of my contribution, I'll feel free to share, well, I'll share my screen, so I'll involve you along this journey with me, please. Okay. So my screen is shared, so I'll continue, well, I'll start. So in terms of the past, right, because we heard the good ambassador speak about the number of sanctions, the value of those sanctions being to the tune of billions of dollars. However, why did those sanctions start? That should be something that we ought to look into. So I can simply say that from 2020, the Venezuelan president, as well as some of his close allies, they were indicted internationally for drug trafficking. So that is against the backdrop that that elections in Venezuela were not being held in a free and fair fashion. Now, mind you, my disclaimer is I cannot say anything about the validity, but I accept what the US has said. That's not my position to question. That's above my pay grade. However, if we look at the past, that's where it is, I think, that a lot of the migration issues from Venezuela started, simply because of that systematic failure in Venezuela. Moving on from that now, and I'll stop. Well, yes, moving on from that now, let's go back to the question. Okay, so what is a gross violation and what is a systematic failure? The systematic failure really and truly would be whereby like the states, NGOs, civil society, or all organizations who want to have an input to deal with crisis or issues, they simply cannot have a proper solution. So that's why we are systematic failure. Gross violations of human rights. What is a gross violation? A gross violation of human rights may be anything negative that affects or so egregious or just really in a bad form or fashion that affects the life of a migrant. So in terms of systematic failures, now let me just show you some examples here. Hold on, share my screen again. All right, so 1 second. All right, so if it is I go, so if I go like inside crime, for example, they speak about inside crime, for example, they speak about President Mujaro, they speak about the whole cocaine revolution, which the US is trying to fight against. So that would be a reason for the past. Now, what happened after that now? We have Venezuelan refugees being feared dead en route to Trinidad and Tobago. We have fleeing migrants feared drowned. We have 35 migrants after gunfire killed by a Coast Guard baby. Now, all these may be cases that persons know about, but those are cases, I dare say, like the law firm to which I'm attached, Quantum Legal, we have actually been on those cases, meaning that they are our cases. So I can tell you the direct impact when it comes to gross violations will be the death of children. But coming on from that also, there'll also be the death of a baby, for example. In the heliport facilities, there will be instances or cases of rape, children being abused. So I'm moving from there. That's all with probes, migrant probes. Okay. 1 second. So I stopped there, right? So I dealt with the ambassador, and then I go to, for example, like Gina. Gina also spoke, which is good. And then, like about the policies with the refugees, about what UNHCR does. However, I would like to highlight that, that when we look at refugees, and this is what really and truly I liked about Ms. Ramnarayan's presentation, she had a child-centric focused presentation. And I would actually like to latch onto that simply because children, to me, they are the greatest persons who have been affected by this crisis. And some of the stories that we hear, it really is inhumane. It really bothers you. So therefore, the systematic failures and gross violations, we have to look at it from a child-centric approach now. And the reason and my basis for saying that simply would be, hold on a second. Let me share my screen again. Yes, the basis for saying that would simply be like the best interest principles of the child. But more than that, hold on. Right, the best interest procedures, the BID and the PIP, the best interest procedures for the child and the best interest of the child. Because in Trinidad and Tobago now, what we have happening would be that children are being separated from their parents. So questions must be asked as to those organizations with the power, what exactly is being done to prevent children from being separated from their parents? What exactly is your policy? What representations are being made to ensure that this crime, that children not being separated from their parents or any abuse of children, for example? What are the local institutions? How child-centric is your policy now in Trinidad and Tobago? And back onto, still onto like what Ms. Gina was saying, is that because she also spoke about the national framework for UNHCR, within that national framework, Section 40 of the Terrorism, and let me just share that this is something that's on my screen is still showing good, perfect. It's like Section 40 of the Terrorism Act, for example. Hold on. Okay. So even Section 40, for example, Section 40 of the Terrorism Act, it has that the minister having regard to the interests of national security and public policy, public safety, could refuse an application for any person applying for the status as a refugee. Now, this Section 40, in terms of the Terrorism Act, we actually found it sometime this year, but it has never been argued and never put forward as part of the legal or policy framework in Trinidad and Tobago that refugees can rely upon. But this also is a part of our case work that we have put before now. We're actually in the Court of Appeal, and we await their decision basically. Then go on. Yes, so that's the past, that's children being affected. So what I really like to say is that children and let me stop share for now. Yeah, so children basically, they are unfortunately, they are the benefactors of gross violation of human rights, which is wrong, and it must be changed. Now, what next? Where do we go from here? And simply that there is a little process called the Universal Periodic Review of the United Nations, basically. And in that Universal Periodic Review, I dare say, all the actions of the state, for example, or the actions of NGOs, or the actions of UNHCR, everything will be examined. And the Universal Periodic Review, that basically is the stage of the United Nations where the country's human rights record shall be examined. Now, back to what Ms. Fiola was saying also about the socio-economic impact, because should it be found by the United Nations, for example, that Trinidad and Tobago constitutes like a lot of grave violation of human rights happens because of our systematic failure, it has the impact to affect us. And that is, and that can be found like in human rights due diligence policy, where our funding by the United Nations may be affected. And back to what Jonathan was saying also regarding the US trafficking in persons reports. There's also something called Leahy Law, where once there's credible information of gross violation of human rights, it could impact the US funding to Trinidad and Tobago, safe and accepting humanitarian situations. I have 6 more minutes if my time is right. Right. So this is where now I go back to what Jonathan is saying, meaning that how can we have a good solution in these issues? Because persons are trafficked. From my personal experience and my knowledge, there's only one body who has been able to, one body of persons who had access to the heliport facility, that basically would be the Venezuelan embassy. So from there, persons who are trafficked, we put forward that they are being coerced under force under the power of voluntary repatriation, basically. So human trafficking isn't being solved because the victims are being carried back to Venezuela ASAP. Even, for example, when the baby was killed, the baby of Sarah Bello, all the victims on that boat, all the witnesses to that killing of the baby, they were deported ASAP. So something must be done to enable an analysis of the trafficking ring from Trinidad to Venezuela to solve the human trafficking issues that also should assist with crime and those migration issues. And all that ties into how do we operate together, both Venezuela, because I have great hope in Venezuela, the Trinidad government, how do we operate to properly fix this migration problem? Is it hopeless? I say no, it's not hopeless, because even though like we go against the Minister of National Security probably on a daily basis, there's still room because we still communicate. So there's always that gap for active persuasion to try to change the culture. And we're actually seeing instances where there's another guy, Emmanuel Acosta. He was a refugee to be resettled, was actually deported. He was able to come back to Trinidad, but through conversations with the ministry, positive conversations with the ministry, he's now in the US. So are we in a totally bad situation? We are in a bad situation, yes. Is it hopeless? No. Can we all, as civil society actors, do better? The answer is yes. Should we focus our activities, especially towards the right of a child, so a child isn't stateless, a child isn't homeless, children don't suffer? I say we probably all need to look at our model again and ensure both the safety of the family, that right to unification, as well as continue along the pathway to actively persuade the government to have a positive outcome from these hard lessons we are learning about systematic failure and gross violations. Back to systematic failure. Last point, please. From 2014, 2015, we're now in 2023. That's about 9 years now since the government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago and UNHCR could actually come up with a solid policy that Trinidad and Tobago could have. So no matter what, we must look at that particular situation, try to find any nuance in that particular situation and find out why isn't it possible? What could be possible? Because I hear persons blaming the government alone. It's two persons in this relationship to have something done, as well as what value of contributions do NGOs and CSOs have towards that national conversation to have a solution in Trinidad and Tobago. And I finish. Thank you very much, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Williams. Thank you so much, and thanks for keeping to the time, because we do have, oh, I'm sorry, my video isn't on. All right, great, my video is on now. Apologies for that. So thank you, Mr. Williams. 5 really excellent contributions made on this topic. Different sides, same issue. And so now we're going to get into the Q&A, because you see how the time is going. And we have at least about 10 questions from our YouTube viewers or online viewers. So I'm going to start with the ambassador. And just a note for all the panelists, there are questions that have been posed to you. So I'm going to try to take them each panelist at a time, if that's possible. So Ambassador, Your Excellency, the first question, I'll read the 2 questions to the ambassador, and then he will provide the response. So Ambassador Sanchez, what efforts has the Venezuelan embassy undertaken? Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, please. Can I ask all the panelists to please put on your cameras? All right. So while we do that, all cameras on, Mr. Williams, Jonathan, Your Excellency, cameras on. All right, great. So we're all sitting in a hot seat now together. Ambassador, first question. What efforts has the Venezuelan embassy undertaken to lobby with the Trinidad and Tobago government for the protection and legal recognition of Venezuelan citizens living in Trinidad and Tobago? That's the first question to the ambassador. Well, probably not the first, there was one before that, right? Ambassador Sanchez. Aside from numbers, you referred to 300,000 migrants returned with Venezuelan government assistance. Has there been a reduction of migration and voluntary returns?
Lana, thank you very much for the questions. Let me start with the last one. According to our records, there has been a return of approximately 1 million Venezuelans coming back to Venezuela from various countries. You can also see, for example, the MRF that initially registered 16,000 Venezuelans in Trinidad and Tobago, and currently there are less than 9,000, about half of them. So that gives you an idea of how many Venezuelans are returning. Because in spite of the fact that sanctions, the so-called sanctions, remain in place, the Venezuelan economy, fortunately, is picking up again. And of course, more people have more opportunities and so on. We're not fully off the hook from the United States, but things are improving somewhat, and therefore you are seeing a pattern of reverse migration in a way. Regarding the other question, Alana, from the onset, let me say that Venezuela is very respectful of internal policies, politics in countries. So we don't interfere with other countries, unlike the United States does to us. It interferes with us all the time, but we don't do that. We're respectful of international law, and therefore we respect what decisions, policies, legislations, and so on emanate from any country, in this case from Trinidad and Tobago. Of course, we're always ready to defend and support Venezuelan nationals who are suffering from aggressions, violation of human rights, and so on. That's part of what embassies do abroad. But this is the reason why as well, President Nicolas Maduro recently called for an international migration conference with all countries, partners, experts, etc., to participate and to come to solutions of recognition, of respect, of equal opportunities, and so on for Venezuelans and people, migrants generally, people from other countries everywhere. There should be an international way to supervise and to monitor that rights of migrants generally are respected. Let me quickly, before I go, because I really have to respond to what Mr. Williams said regarding the false allegation of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro being a drug dealer. Let me call this book. The title of the book is El Cartel de los Soles, a new fabrication to attack Venezuela, by Dr. Fernando Casados, a Spanish analyst and researcher who has written a book, well-documented book, that explains by detail how these allegations of Venezuela being a narco state is a fabrication of fake news by the CIA and a Spanish newspaper, ABC. It's a total fabrication. It's in the book. You can read the book and then we reach to conclusion. But nonetheless, why, in any case, assuming, for example, that it was true that the president or government officials were drug dealers, who is the United States to judge Venezuela on that? We have our own courts, we have our own system. To let the United States be the policeman of the world is to comply with what is called American exceptionalism, that the United States is morally higher than the rest of the world. I refuse to accept that. And I believe that all of us working for the benefit of human rights and people should not take such a consideration lightly, allowing American exceptionalism to rule. But moreover, the United States sanctioning other countries is against Article 2 of the United Nations Charter. No country can interfere or meddle or sabotage any other country. We are here to respect the United. We have a representative of the United Nations in this body, Ms. Gina Maharaj, and the multilateralism should rule. Not an individual country should not be ruling and determining and punishing the rest of the world. Now, is it the first time that the United States says something that is not true? Let me remind you of what they said about Iraq having weapons of mass destruction. It was a lie, right? Well, many other lies the United States had put in place internationally to advance their imperialistic agenda. If we are not willing to question what the United States, terrible things that the United States has done historically in the world, how can we go out and protect anyone? If we are willing to just give a green light to the United States to do the horrible, hideous things that they have been doing. Last and not least, if assuming, for example, that the Venezuelan government were involved in sanctions, assuming, for example, that there was no United Nations body, and therefore the United States will be ruling and sanctioning a Venezuelan president. Now, why the rest of Venezuelans have to suffer? As I said, 40,000 Venezuelans died out of the sanctions. Do you find fair that by going after one individual, 40,000 Venezuelans have to die? Do you agree that many Venezuelans have to leave the country who have no responsibility and no links whatsoever with any kind of drug dealing or anything? Why are they paying the consequences? So think about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Woo, that was a whole 10-course meal there of response. So I know the other panelists also would have your opportunity, and His Excellency introduced it, where if you do want to respond to any of the contributions made by the other panelists and answering your questions, please do so, considering our time frame though. So Gina, the next set of questions are for you. I think 2 questions came through for you. The first one is, thank you for the definitions that you provided. In this regard, which category would Venezuelans in Trinidad be placed? And I think she's referring to your definitions on asylum seeker, refugee, and migrant. All right, the other question is, even though in context we know economic migration is a major factor, can any party, the receiving country, UNHCR, or the country of origin, have authority not to recognize refugee status?
Okay, thank you. Those are really good questions. So in response to the first question, Venezuelan nationals will fall under all categories. So there will be persons who've applied for asylum, those who have been granted refugee status, those who are born in Trinidad and a dual national of Trinidad and Venezuela. Some have been resident here and have legal residency status. And some persons I mean, like with all nationalities and countries around the world, they would be in an irregular situation as well. So it would be all categories they would fall into. And of course, it would be, in terms of international protection needs, it would be dependent on whether or not they applied for asylum, or maybe they fall under some other protected status. And in response to the second question, now all persons who meet that 1951 definition of who a refugee is should be recognized as a refugee as such by countries. So approximately 148 countries have signed on to the 1951 Refugee Convention. Now, we cannot say in practice what happens in every state around the world in terms of how countries apply refugee status determination, how they treat with asylum seekers and refugees, but countries worldwide ought to abide by the principles of the convention and also provide international protection to persons who are asylum seekers and refugees.
Okay, thank you, Gina. And I just want to add some more things. Actually, I'm gonna kind of throw something at you, right? You mentioned that Trinidad and Tobago acceded to the Refugee Convention. Angie spoke about ratification of the UN Convention. So I noticed some persons, it may not be clear what is the difference between acceding to a UN convention and ratifying a UN convention, because I believe that is where a lot of the misunderstanding is, in the public with respect to the current obligations of Trinidad and Tobago.
So a very good question. So basically, ratification and accession, they both have the same effect in terms of international law, meaning if a country ratifies an international treaty or they acceded to it, they are bound to abide by the terms of that treaty, give effect in domestic legislation to the terms of that treaty. However, the difference is in really procedure. So they have the same effect and they basically mean the same thing. It's just that the procedure that a country would have undergone in terms of acceding or ratifying the treaty was different. So as I understand it, when it comes to ratification, countries who ratified a treaty would have been part of the initial negotiations. They would have been allowed to make comments, suggestions, and then they would have ratified a treaty. But in terms of accession, countries that acceded to a treaty would not have been part of those initial negotiations. So I hope that sort of clears up that differentiation between both terminologies.
Okay, thank you so much. And the persons can always read up some more on it. I have one question for you, Gina, though. Gina, what if a migrant, they have applied for asylum, so they're an asylum seeker, their application is in, status has not yet been determined, and they say they wish to return to Venezuela? Because there are several, I think, who have indicated their wish and have returned to Venezuela.
Yeah. So again, another very good question, and it is a durable solution that UNHCR promotes, and that is voluntary repatriation. Now, in many circumstances, asylum seekers, they decide to return home because the risk that they would have faced when they initially left has gone, or the situations in the country that they're fleeing from, the situation has improved, and they decide to return home, and they have that right to abandon their claim and to return home. Some countries around the world, they have procedures and formalities with governments in terms of repatriating people. In Trinidad, we don't have that system. So what UNHCR does as an organization, we do counseling sessions, voluntary repatriation counseling sessions, whereby we inform persons that their cases will be closed, they will no longer be registered with UNHCR, and then they are free to leave the country on their own terms.
So then is it that the migrant is obligated to come to the UNHCR and say, I'm going back home? Because many of them do not come to the UNHCR and say that, they may just return home.
Yes, and many do, but ideally they should come and inform us that they're leaving, so then we could close their case because they will no longer be in the country.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much. Okay. The next set of questions would be for Larms, Angie. All right. I'm seeing one question so far, but I'll scroll down to see if there are others. So Angie, great job. this person comments, what are some ways you have encountered legislative challenges in providing services to migrants and refugees? They also ask a question, but I don't know, I don't think this is for you, Angie, but I'll throw it out to the entire panel so that you could think of it in the meantime. Has there been any update with regard to the Venezuelan nationals that have been at the Chaguaramas heliport? So that's for everybody, and Angie, well, the question for you.
The question is what ways that I encounter legislative
challenges, in providing services to migrants and refugees.
Okay, well, that's almost like every day. I mentioned things. Okay, so I believe the whole thing with schooling and so on. And you see, everybody's fuzzy as to what is legal and what's not when it comes to migrants. So I have had cases where there are children of Trinidad parentage, and the father may have passed. I had one particular case like this. And I tried to get that child into normal primary school because his father is Trinidadian. All right. And the principal of the primary school is afraid, right? She's afraid that he will still be, he's considered a migrant child and he hasn't met the student permits and all of that. And what I have found is that once they or their families can afford to go into fee-paying schools where they pay fees, you know, they're easy, all right? They don't have to comply with student permits and so on. So sometimes some of the most expensive schools in the country, I mean, the students, once they can pay, they won't have to pass through any kind of what they call it, students permit and all of that. So in a way, money buys them ease of access, right? But many of them don't fall into that group. I have had a fuzziness, especially in the health sector. Today I was called by a private doctor who was treating a migrant that I know for potential cancer, right? And that procedure privately is going to cost $12,000 to $15,000. And the doctor knows that the migrant cannot pay for the procedure, but says that she will still give the migrant a letter to go to the hospital to see if the procedure can be done there if they decide to do it. But she lets on that when she used to work in the hospital, she used to try to help migrants, but she doesn't know what kind of treatment she will get there. Simple things like, and I don't even know how founded in legality these things are. I've also had Venezuelans needing blood in the hospital, and the medical professionals telling me that other Venezuelans cannot be donors of blood to their own relatives unless they can show that they have a valid passport and they've been in the country for 3 years and things like that. And when you have these kinds of things happening that affect life and death situations, it really gets stressful, right? Because you have people dying, and the solution is simple. We have people willing line up outside the hospital or willing to give blood, but they're being told by medical professionals that Venezuelans can't give blood, you know. And there are things like these I deal on a daily basis, you know, where you want to do things to help people improve the quality of their life, and you're getting all kinds of legal arguments as to why you can't.
Angie, that must be a very frustrating position to be in every day.
It is. It is every day.
I'm hoping that you have an avenue to de-stress in some way, you know, to offload, because I mean, it's human nature that we care, you know, and I think anybody with a heart would care for things like that, you know.
Yes.
So I do hope you have a positive avenue to de-stress and offload.
Well, long ago I used to go to Venezuela for holidays.
Oh my
to de-stress.
Well, we can still go because I understand they're open flights now. I understand there's discussion to open flights, regular flights between Trinidad and Caracas. So
yes.
Margarita, you know, we had a
Margarita used to be
Margarita,
there.
you know, yeah.
All the time.
I know the ambassador is working hard at bringing back a lot of those cultural ties, reminding us as Trinidad
Yes.
cultural ties, you know. I myself learned Spanish in the Venezuelan embassy. That was one of the first places, and I've been to Margarita and Caracas several times
Yes.
in the
Yes.
past, you know. So we do have those cultural ties.
Yes.
Yes. So Angie, thank you so much for the excellent work you're doing, and keep at it. I know you're going to continue to get the support that you need.
Thank you for your encouragement.
Yes. All right. So we're moving on to Jonathan. There are a couple questions for Jonathan. Do you see any collaborations with the Ministry of National Security and CARICOM Affairs? I'm not sure who's the CARICOM Affairs. And also, if one political party in TNT decides for the protection of migrant rights, would there be a chance of the other parties going against them or the matter being treated in bipartisan sense? And the other question for Jonathan, I think I missed the first one for you. Is there some legislative committee that can pioneer the area of sex crimes against migrants and refugees?
Okay, I'll take the last question first. We already have good, the Sexual Offences Act is already good law. The problem in Trinidad is usually not the law, it is lack of enforcement, lack of, I have helped survivors of like rape and different things. Like they formed a WhatsApp group to talk about this rapist, how many of us, and they went to the police station together, and I'm waiting 2 years now for that matter to be the rapist to be charged. So the problem is usually delays in the police service, unwillingness to, you know, push the hard work. So there's no need. The refugee protection would help the sex crimes against refugees. Not the actual criminal law is fine. Can you repeat the other questions? Okay, you're muted, Alana.
All right. There was one about right, that's the legislative committee. Do you see any collaborations with National Security and CARICOM Affairs? I'm not sure in what
Yeah,
context.
that's Amy Brown and Fitzgerald Hines. I believe they would collaborate to the best of their moral and intellectual capabilities.
Okay. And if one political party in TNT decides for the protection of migrant rights, would there be a chance of the other parties going against them or the matter being treated in bipartisan sense?
I would hope, since the United States and the United Nations are pushing us towards, we already, technically there shouldn't be a debate because we already signed the treaty. We just have to pass. All we have to do is call Belize and copy and paste their refugee policy and pass it. It's very easy. So I don't think there would be a debate. There might, given how toxic our politics is, it may be that one party would say we were allowing it, and the next party would take a somewhat racist position just to rile up a crowd and get, we have a toxic political system, but we already have an international law obligation. And if I was a judge, I would have done the Jason Jones and Attorney General reasoning and said, we already signed this, and there's cases around the world where once you sign a treaty, the judges will interpret the law in the country as in line with the treaty because you have that obligation anyway. So yes, that's the extent of my contribution.
Well, you know, we have had judgment with respect to this whole refugee situation in Trinidad and Tobago. But, you know, when we sign a treaty, the onus is now on the state to have internal discussions with respect to what's the next stage with that treaty. So it is not that it's a force on the state, really. It is just that the internal discussions have to happen in the parliamentary level for the state to decide how exactly they're going to implement what obligations they have under that international treaty. But I'm not a lawyer, but just in my
that is a good position, Alana. I think you have more IR experience than me, but I would say either we pass the refugee law or we repudiate the treaty, because we are basically breaching international law every day. We don't have this policy.
Well, I would look at the example of Guyana. In fact, in the Caribbean, CARICOM region, I am not aware of any CARICOM country that has actually passed refugee law. I think maybe Belize may have a bit in their laws, but none of the CARICOM countries have passed, or domestic refugee law. But when we look at how Guyana has a policy with respect to the Venezuelan migrants, right? And so their policy is that they allow the migrants to come in and they regularize the migrant status and they allow them to work and everything, right? Every migrant that they find, Venezuelan migrant. So that's how they've dealt with it at a policy level. So in the absence of law, actual domestic law, there are ways that policies can be implemented to treat with the situation, you know, and Aruba and Curacao, I think they have also found ways to treat with the influx of Venezuelan migrants. So again, I'm not a lawyer, but that's just my 2 cents in there, right? So the other question is for Ms. Cooper. And we do have Mr. Williams, we're leaving the best for last. All right, so Ms. Cooper, the question to you is, do you think there is competition for jobs between Trinidadian and Venezuelan nationals because persons presume they can get more work for less monies?
I did not hear the start of the question. So can you just repeat for me?
Sure, certainly. Do you think there is competition for jobs between Trinidadian and Venezuelan nationals because persons presume they can get more work for less monies? In other words, business persons feel they can hire cheap labor. So
Yes,
there now becomes a competition between the Venis and the Trinis to get jobs.
Well, I mean, there are 2 ways of, in terms of looking at that, right? We do have an influx of migrant workers who are available to work. We also have a situation whereby we have nationals who don't want to work. So for instance, you will walk in the malls and you will see signs up saying, workers needed, apply, and you would wonder how come Trinidadians are not applying, and then you would see migrant workers working. You know, so, I mean, I wouldn't say there's a competition because I think that there are jobs available. And I believe that some Trinidadians simply don't want jobs. They prefer, they're very picky and selective as to what jobs they wish to do. And because of that, it opens up the opportunity for migrant workers to actually receive the job. And I mean, we also have to look at the salaries that employers pay to migrant workers. In most instances, migrant workers would work for less, would accept a lower salary just to have a job.
Yes, but you know, it's the same thing that happens when we Trinidadians go to New York and we go to Toronto and we go to England, that we accept very minimal paying jobs.
Yes, it's the same thing in Trinidad.
Same principle, you know, and I mean, that's the whole process of migration and irregular migration and stuff, you know. So, I would say so. And, you know, even within Trinidad, there are certain industries where we do require labor. For example, in the agricultural sector, in construction, you know, there are areas where persons can work and we can employ them. You know?
And as well as the, I mean, we are seeing as well in terms of employers and clients complaining, migrant workers are actually showing up for work every day versus our own Trinidad nationals who decide, okay, today is not a good day for me and they're not showing up. So there's also, you know, aspects of employers preferring migrant workers because they are more reliable.
And they're willing to work the longer hours.
They are willing.
And the extra hours,
But at the same time, we also need to keep in mind that it is not an opportunity, especially for employers, to decide, you know, that they can get away from paying, for instance, minimum wage or overtime. That is still applicable to migrant workers.
And I think that is where LARMS and other organizations and lawyers come in to inform them of their rights, you know. And you mentioned what you mentioned earlier too, that they can make reports to the Ministry of Labor. A lot of them are not aware, even though they are illegal.
I think that one of the issues that migrants face is that as is it Ms. Jitana, I don't want to say her name incorrectly. Angie would have mentioned the fair aspect that migrant workers have. If they are confident migrant workers, I've met a few of them who understand that they have rights and they pursue it. But there are also, you know, a big fraction of migrant workers who are just afraid to approach any institution that represents the state, because they believe it's you know, they may be held against their will, they may be deported, you know, so that fair aspect does affect, you know, their choice or their decision to go forward and report, you know. But recently, as in today, when I spoke to the Ministry of Labor, they said that they are seeing more and more migrant workers coming forward and making reports, and they are following through on their behalf as well.
Yes, yes, I know they're quite
Yeah.
diligent in following up on
Yes,
their
they are.
reports and complaints. So
Yes.
that's some excellent work. Hopefully we could see more of that happening, you know, in the other migrant communities. I know, Angie, you deal with the South,
Yes.
but there are some other NGOs that work with the migrants and they can get that information.
Yes.
So, yes, so thank you so much, Ms. Cooper.
Yes.
Mr. Williams, I know he's waiting patiently to come on board. So I have two more questions here that I'm going to read. I'm going to put them to Mr. Williams, and then if any of the other panelists would like to respond, feel free to do so. So the question is, when children are born in Trinidad to migrants that are not legalized, what is put in place for protection of these children? And Mr. Williams is very passionate about children and the family, as I think we all should be. But Mr. Williams, I hear it in his voice that he really does have a extra passion and drive for children, you know. Children are our future, and children are to be protected regardless of their nationality, regardless of their immigration status. Children do have rights according to the Convention on the Rights of the Children. So, Mr. Williams, that's a question for you. While he's waiting to prepare his response, Jonathan, there's a question that came for you regard to the collaboration between the committee you had along with the Ministry of National Security and Ministry of Foreign Affairs as it pertains to sex crimes. I think that's the question the person was asking, right? So you answer that after. Let me just get Mr. Williams first. Mr. Williams, again, when children are born in Trinidad to migrants that are not legalized, what is put in place for protection of these children?
And presently, to the best of my knowledge, nothing actually is in place. Nothing at all, to the best of my knowledge. And that has several repercussional effects. And I would like to draw it back into a question, Ms. Wheeler, that you asked about what's the latest update with the heliport and the persons who were detained there. So if I could pull in those two answers.
Definitely, okay, yes.
Perfect. So let me go to the heliport issue first, because then it will tie into children born in Trinidad, and it will be easier to answer that way. But again, the law firm I'm associated with these quantum legal people, they happen to represent at least 64 persons who were detained at the heliport facility, that recent deportation process. It's actually a very funny story, meaning that half the persons were released, half the persons were deported, 10 women remained in Trinidad and Tobago, all who had children, and I'll come back to those 10 women and the children subsequently, and the rest were deported. All of those who were deported, they soon returned in about a week or less to Trinidad. They made a report to the Commissioner of Police indicating that the Minister of National Security would have broken, and or the Immigration Department would have broken several laws in accordance with the Immigration Act. They expelled a sector of society in accordance with the International Criminal Act, Section 10, meaning that members of the LGBTQ plus community, as well as the Venezuelan community. So that's the update, which is for the heliport facility. So moving from that now, I go to the 10 women who were kept in Trinidad and Tobago. No, I don't want to incur the good ambassador's wrath, because I would still like to invite him out for lunch with Gina and I, because we are all based in Princess Court. So the ambassador could come, meet Gina, meet myself, we go across the river waters right there, and he could share me a copy of his book, which I appreciate a good conversation. However, very alarmingly and or worrisomely, if that's a word, that we have reports, credible reports, that the embassy in Trinidad, they would have contacted some of the persons who were taking care of the children, the 10 women in the heliport, and basically to ask them, or I would use the word pressure them, to have the children go to the heliport. When this happened, back to the question now with regards to what happens to the migrants born in Trinidad. So when these 10 women were deported, it actually raised questions regarding trafficking of children, because from our information, some children were born in Trinidad. They were not registered in Trinidad. A birth certificate appeared for them from Venezuela, and they were moved. From our information also, when a child was born in Trinidad, the mother was still deported, basically. So we have instances of children being stateless, and that is not a category of persons acceptable in any right-thinking democratic society worldwide. And that is something that I see that, and I would like to if it's possible, and if possible, like all stakeholders, we work very strongly against that serious indictment of a child being considered stateless, and or to prevent any allegations of children being trafficked, because that's another category that you never want your country to find yourself in. Stateless children being trafficked. So that's the latest update in her report. That's with regards to children who are born in migrants and not properly registered and or documented in Trinidad and Tobago. And also there's the fear. The fear that I am illegal, there's no proper framework to protect me. Because a lot of children are being born, I guess. And then they may be born by midwives outside of the hospital system because of that fear to go and register because I may be arrested. So it has repercussionary effects, which has long-term effects on the best interests of the children moving forward in the future.
Wow. Angie, what has been your experience in working with the migrants? I'm sure you've had to deal with cases like this. Angie, unmute your mic.
Yes, all the time. I can well understand what Mr. Williams is saying, because the fear factor is very strong. Now, I had a case where they actually got the documents after fighting with the hospital to go now to the Ministry of Legal Affairs to get the child's birth certificate. And somehow they did. They thought, okay, my child is born in Trinidad, is entitled to, well, is a Trinidadian. So maybe I should go and apply for a passport. Well, I don't know when that was a big mistake, because as soon as they went to the immigration office with the child's passport papers and so on, the immigration picked up that the parents were here illegally and then subjected them to the order of supervision. All right. So that whole order supervision process is a whole thing that takes away days, hours and days out of a migrant working. If you see how they're treated, so they go there and they stand up with their newborn baby and other little child for hours in the sun and rain until they can see an immigration officer. And these parents just got fed up of the process. They went back to Venezuela. And now they are on their way through the Darien jungle to try to make it to the States. All right.
So what became of the birth certificates for the children?
Well, not all of them have the documentation to get the birth certificate, because apparently what they need is they register from the hospital where the child was born. And if some of them not born in the hospital, I've had children being born in abandoned containers and all sorts of things like that. Right? And born to parents who are not confident enough to go and try to see how they could tango with the authorities here. You know how intimidating it is to walk in with no language to try to explain that you want a birth certificate for your child. The process is off-putting, and I honestly cannot be with everybody all of the time to do this. I have accompanied some people and so on. But, to get people to accompany people who are timid and unsure to go through these government bureaucracies to do what is right for their child is sometimes so intimidating. And sometimes people prefer to live in obscurity in the bush somewhere.
Yes. That's really unfortunate.
Ms. Miller, if I may just quickly,
yes, Mr. Williams.
Very, very quickly, please. With respect to the heliport matter again, just like in terms of the latest update, that matter comes up on November the 27th in the Court of Appeal. And the Court of Appeal, very rarely, they said that this is a matter that is fit for urgent hearing. And they are going to succinctly speak and or comment on the CPSR decision, where Justice CPSR said certain things about the refugees in Trinidad and Tobago. That was made abundantly clear. They are going to rule directly on Trinidad and Tobago obligations, considering UNHCR for their determination before deportation. So on that narrow point, as to Trinidad and Tobago obligations towards UNHCR, a 3-panel judge in the Court of Appeal, they are going to adjudicate on our responsibilities in Trinidad and Tobago. And that case, I dare say, would actually settle our international obligations, refugee status in Trinidad and Tobago. It would set the precedent moving forward.
Yes. Okay, well, we're praying, right? We're praying and hoping, yes. Jonathan, yes.
Hi, so just in response to my committee working with the Ministry of National Security. So one of the main objectives of my committee was to establish, in 2015, this was founded by Camille St. Omer, a US citizen who was from St. Lucia. And the objective was to establish a Caribbean sex offenders registry that networks with the United States of America. We have been sending this information. There's a law called the International Migrants Law, where the US shares data of the traveling sex offenders, and they have a database. And we have a partnership with the software company that does most of the US sex offender databases. So the US now, if a sex offender in the US messages your child on Snapchat and you have the app on the child's phone, the parents will know what's going on. If the child's phone goes to the address of a sex offender, the parents will be notified. So we have a sex offender registry law that was passed in 2019 after 4 years of our advocacy. It was passed in 2019, and it didn't include the provision to network with the United States government. So in 2020, we had a partnership with this software company called Offender Watch. And this was featured on Fox News. This was the #3 article on Fox World News Online. So like 100 million people saw this, and I sent this to Faris Alwari. I sent this all over Trinidad, and the government has been dragging its feet to work with my committee. So this year, my committee was invited to Interpol's. There's an Interpol, but it's a meeting in the Interpol headquarters of International Sex Offender Registry professionals. And I sent an email to National Security and a physical letter to the Office of the Attorney General, Permanent Secretary. And I called the Office of the Attorney General, Permanent Secretary, and I got 10 minutes of explanation as to why they cannot help me in any way, form, or fashion. And my current sponsor to go to France is a bar and a restaurant called Jade Monkey in Tobago. So just shout out Jade Monkey. They are fighting crime, in my opinion, better than Mr. Fitzgerald Hines, in my humble opinion. So thank you very much for your question.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. All right, so we're going to wrap up now. So I'm going to ask all the panelists to think of what would be your final parting words or parting sentence for all the listeners we have. I think we have quite a few persons online who really made some other comments and contributions. Won't have time to read through all of their comments, but they did make some positive comments. So I think we can start with, we'll start in the order that we presented, and just for you to give your final parting words. So I'll start with Gina.
Well, I would like to thank you all for inviting UNHCR to this panel. It was a very fruitful discussion. I would just like to say that the issue surrounding asylum seekers and refugees is not within the responsibility of one organization or one agency. It's a whole of society approach. It's a collective approach, and every agency, organization, including the state, has their approach, responsibilities, and it's really important that we all work together to find solutions in responding to inflows of asylum seekers.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Gina. Angie?
Well, I just want to a bit echo what Gina has said, because truth be told, I thought this would turn out to be just another talk shop. But what it actually did for me was enlighten me in so many ways of all the different aspects of this phenomenon of migration and immigration, you know, that we need to understand, and we need to understand the whole thing holistically. And people like Mr. Bagger, Mr. Williams, and Ms. Cooper would have all dealt with different aspects of what occurs when you are a host country dealing with migrants and refugees. So I just hope that this is the start of further dialogue, and hope that we can bring some pressure on the authorities, the people who have the power to make decisions, to do something, so we come out of the inertia that we're in.
Yes. Thank you very much, Angie. I'm going to ask the ambassador to be on standby to give his last closing remarks when the panelists do give their remarks. Jonathan? Jonathan, you unmute.
Hi, sorry, my niece is throwing objects in the next room. She's 2 years old. So I would say that the people of Trinidad and Tobago need to pressure our politicians from both parties to take legislation seriously and take the job seriously and stop dragging their feet.
Oh dear. Okay. All right, Jonathan. Thanks for being so expressive. Miss Cooper.
Yes, good afternoon. I just want to take the opportunity, of course, to thank the panel. It was very informative. I mean, I was edified definitely in terms of theory as well, from the theoretical aspect in terms of the legislative framework. And I mean, it has opened up, I think, everyone's eyes as to how much work is required to, improve the current system that we currently have in Trinidad and Tobago specifically. I want to take this opportunity though to, just to remind the migrants that migrant workers as well as, non-nationals that, there are some, it's not perfect, it's not a perfect system, of course, but there are avenues that they can explore. And, sometimes it just takes one person to ask a question, and they may be surprised that they get a positive, response in some aspect. It would not always be the case, but they can still try, and that they can feel free to approach NIS specifically if they have any questions. I always say go to the source. Go to the source and ask a question about the options that are actually available. And also the Ministry of Labor. They are very, very conducive to entertaining persons. I mean, I know Angie would have spoken about the fact that some of them cannot speak English. So that's something that I could ask, talk to them about to see what we could put in place or what they can put in place to facilitate non-English speaking migrants, to facilitate the process. But it's something that we should all work on. And any help that I could provide, I will see how best I could assist Angie or Gina, if required, to provide information if needed.
Excellent. Thank you, Ms. Cooper. And that's what this is all about, us working together because we all want the same thing, and that is to help our Venezuelan brothers and sisters. Mr. Williams, and then we'll have the ambassador. Yes, Mr. Williams. Unmute your mic, Mr. Williams. Yes.
Yes, good day. Firstly, I honestly have faith and hope that once, if we have groups like this in Trinidad and Tobago, persons, right-minded thinking persons in the country, once those persons come together, we can seriously have a better Trinidad and Tobago if we focus on our country's human rights. Also, with respect to Venezuela, once whatever issues between Trinidad, Venezuela, with international partners think about human rights in Venezuela, the relationship between refoulement, refugees, or that whole migrant issue between Trinidad and Venezuela. Once we could show that, that we are actively trying to work better, both Venezuela and Trinidad together, I dare say that it may ultimately result in a much better country, both for Trinidad and Tobago in the long term, and especially it may also have much better or more favorable terms for any dragon deal where US oversight apparently is still a bit important. So my conclusion is really and truly, let's work together, Mr. Ambassador, please. Trinidad and Tobago, let's work together, please. We have long-term success, long-term goals that could only be realized with our very powerful friend in Venezuela, who will 14 country in oil and gas. So we stand a lot to benefit. Because who could tell? Because I know like a long time back in the days, I think persons went across Venezuela when Trinidad was hard. Who can tell when the situation may be reversed? And Mr. Ambassador, if my grandchildren, well, I have no children, but if my nieces and nephews have to come across to Venezuela, I certainly and I honestly hope that they shall not be treated the same way that your country folk are treated in Trinidad and Tobago. And don't forget the lunch invitation, please, with Gina and I.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. Ambassador. Ambassador, unmute your mic.
Sorry. Thank you very much. I am looking forward to that lunch soon. So, no, but thank you very much for the cordial invitation. It has been a very enlightening experience for me. Many aspects that you as experts in the law and in all these issues, deeper issues, related to migration for me are new, and therefore it has been a very, very important learning experience. So I appreciate that. I will also take the word of both Ms. Fayola and Mr. Williams in terms of all of us working together. We at the Venezuelan Embassy were obviously open. Sometimes I noticed that in the time that I have been here in Trinidad, that sometimes we have information or documentation or advice about certain issues that situations that occurred with Venezuelan nationals in Trinidad, and perhaps for not approaching us, things are delayed or so. But sometimes we obviously are in a position where we can be vital for the well-being, the survival, the protection of our Venezuelan nationals. And of course, I will finish with my conveying my gratitude to all of you, because the fact that you are engaged in this, we may have difference of opinions here and there on the how, perhaps, but the final objective, which is the protection of Venezuelan nationals, the protection of human beings, the protection of working class people. We spoke, you clearly spoke about the fact that how workers in Trinidad, workers in Venezuela, at the end of the day, they say workers of the world unite. If we keep that in mind, as you do, that's something that we highly appreciate. We applaud you for that, and we express our sincere gratitude for giving all that you do in your work capacities, personal capacities, as many of you have mentioned, for the protection, betterment of Venezuelan nationals. That's something that we will always be highly appreciative of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ambassador. And thank you to all of the panelists. I do wish you an enjoyable lunch when you do have that lunch together. And so I'm now going to hand over to Ms. Catalia Cato. She is an IR student with the University IR faculty, and she is going to give a closing remarks and a vote of thanks.
Good evening, well, good night now to each and every one of you. I hope you all hear me fine. Right, nice. Right, so all protocols observed. To you all, good evening. To the students, lecturers, and staff members present, I say good evening to you all as well. I sit here on behalf of the Institute of International Relations, the student body, and its staff to express my heartfelt thanks to all those who have made this event possible, well, this webinar possible. To all the panelists for taking the time to participate in this webinar today, for sensitizing us, or rather extending your knowledge on a subject matter that is now becoming a growing issue in our country. I say thank you. And I would like to thank each and everyone present, whether it be on the live stream or on the Zoom link provided. I say thank you to you all for participating and for asking questions. This webinar would not have been possible without each and every one of you, and your contributions have not gone unnoticed. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you again, Catalia Cato, and thank you to all of our viewers online on YouTube. And have a great night, everyone, and see you at the next session. Goodbye, everyone.